Well, the book transitions us back to the Windsors and their current problems, and that is that they are in limbo. They have nowhere to go, and they just seem to refuse to put down any kind of roots. They're just wandering hither, thither, and yon. The Windsors continue to be in limbo. Chips Channon wrote in his diary in March 1938. Disturbing news of the Windsors. They dine alone night after night, ignored, snubbed by the French, and neglected by the English. The Duke of Windsor is, of course, very pro-German. He maintains that had he been on the throne, the German coup in Austria would never have happened. He said, "I should have appealed personally to Hitler," which I thought was rather pathetic. He is lonely and so bored. Okay, imagine the hubris of thinking that you could have stopped Hitler. I would have had a personal meeting with Hitler. But it's like, okay, well, but when you were trying to have a personal meeting with Hitler, he couldn't even rouse himself up out of the bed to see you. And then when he finally did stumble out of the back bed, you weren't even allowed to talk to him directly. You had to talk to him through an interpreter, even though you both spoke German. So how exactly do you think that you have the authority, or would have had the authority, to call him up and say, "Hey, you really shouldn't take Austria"? And he'd be like, "Oh, yes, that's a very, very good idea. I was in the wrong. I shouldn't have thought about doing it. I never should have thought about taking Austria. It's not for me. It's not mine." It never would have happened. So enough with this already of him thinking he would. And it's like, by the way, well, if I'd still been on the throne, you chose to get off of it. So if you really think that you had this incredible pull where nobody would listen to the dictators were doing whatever, but then you arrived on the scene and then you were able to talk sense into them. If you really thought that you had that kind of gravitas, then why did you ever abdicate a role in which you could have done the world some good? But it's all well and good now to say, well, if I were there. Well, you're not. So what, even if you somehow had, you were a dictator whisperer and you could make the dictator do what you wanted. Well, it's too late now. The journalist Colin Brooks, running into a couple at the sporting club in Monte Carlo that month, provided a portrait of them at the time. This journalist wrote, "Leading a little knot of people through the bowing functionaries came a small, tight-lipped, dark-haired woman, very regal in her carriage, followed by two nondescripts, and then a very miniature of a man with blonde hair, a very red face, and the general demeanor of a happy grocer's boy. It was the Duke of Windsor. To my eye, he looked tanned and well and far more composed than when I last saw him. There was no fiddling with his tie. His hands were thrust in his trouser pockets. She was the focal point of the little party, not he. Her face had become palpably harder. She is the creature of hard lines altogether. The dark hair parted and smoothed down like the painted hair of a Dutch doll, the line of the mouth hard, the eyes hard, the severe black dress cut in hard lines." What an excellent description. People really knew how to write back then. And I think it's very interesting that she was the focal part of the little party and he was the one tottering behind. Who does this remind you of, my friends? Because it's like once Meghan and Harry became a couple, she was the focal point. Everyone was talking about them because they were really talking about her. And he was always the afterthought, the tag on to the story. And I mean, all we have to do is think back to that Time magazine cover where he's standing behind her. And there she is dressed in the white, this glowing figure. And he's hunched behind her, draped in black. I mean, it's like nothing has ever signaled more visually than that the roles have become reversed. The prince is now the pauper. And I think that these women attach themselves to these weak men because they know that they'll be able to be the focal point. Meghan never had any doubt that she'd be the focal point. And I don't think that Wallis ever thought that she wouldn't be the focal point, because they have the strength of character to push ahead, to elbow their way in front. The men that they're with can hardly dress themselves in the morning, So it's not really surprising that she was the focal point, but it is sad that they weren't at least arm in arm and together, that she's walking not one person ahead of him, but two people ahead of him. And he's just dawdling along behind. But it's sad, but it would be much more sad if it was not something he had chosen. But he chose that he should be dawdling behind. There was a part of him, I think, that liked that he was with somebody that was so strong and powerful that she could push her way to the front. I think there was a part of him that was attracted to the power that she of her personality, that where she wanted to find herself, on this ladder, she had figured out a way to get there. I think that kind of dominance was attractive to him because he lacked it in his own personality. And so he was, I think at the same time, as much as he was lured by it, I think he was threatened by it, because as we'll see, he becomes a very sad little man, knowing that he'll never have what she has in her ability to grasp and to claim what doesn't belong to her. She's aggressive enough to take what she wants, and he is not able to do that. And if he was, he would have been able to figure out a way to be king and have her, So now, I don't know. I just think that it's not surprising that she was the one in the front, and he might have looked like a happy grocer's boy at that moment, because it's all still new and different, and he's gotten the life that he thought he wanted. But once they've really settled into it, I wonder how much of a happy grocer boy he looked then. In May 1938, the Windsors found their summer villa, like it's some kind of necessity. And it was this 3-story gleaming white villa with green shutters, matching awnings, and behind high walls and hedges, it was set in 12 acres of garden and woodland, with fir, pine, yew, eucalyptus, and cypress trees, reached by a narrow winding road from the port. It included a tennis court, servants' quarters, greenhouses, garages, and on either side of the entrance gate was a small lodge that provided accommodation for the staff. Previous to this, it had been occupied by other Windsors, and also by King Leopold III of Belgium and Queen Marie of Italy. So this was absolutely royal accommodations. Interestingly, he cannot seem to give up the fact that he's not the king anymore, that he may be of royal blood, but he gave up his royalty. Yet he's still decking this place out as though he were just that he were still the king, he's just vacationing here for the summer. The house was built around a huge central hall dominated by the Duke's red and gold Order of Garter banner, which ran the full depth of the house, off which led large rooms with 25-foot high ceilings. 25-foot high ceilings? I can't even conceive. And tall mirrored doors. On the right of the hall was the dining room, which could seat 24, and where hung Alfred Mooning's The Prince of Wales on Forest Witch, while on the left was a drawing room and paneled library. Listen, as we continue on in this description, it's crazy. Everything had been decorated by their friend Elsie Mandel. Remember, she's the one who invented interior decorating. In Buckingham Palace colors of white, red, and gold. This is just audacious. Like, you guys are not the king and queen. I guess if you're really into white, red, and gold, but it seems to me that that would not be a color combo that I would come up with for my house if I were not in a palace. And it's just, I guess it's not in my taste. I wouldn't want that. But I also think it would be even less in my taste if I was living in exile. I would not want to copy what I had been exiled from. I would want to create a wholly new thing, and I would, since I'm the one who decided that I was going to abdicate, I would want to create a home that showed that I'm very much okay with this new thing that I chose. I think the effort to replicate a former thing is very pathetic. But they did it. Dining chairs were of red leather with gold and black backs. The red and white library was dominated by a huge portrait of Queen Mary over the marble fireplace, and there was a Steinway grand piano at which the Duke would play when the Duchess was absent. There were mirrors over the fireplaces and on many doors, a mark of Wallace's style, and glass, china, furniture, and linen from Fort Belvedere and York House. It's just page after page describing their luxurious lifestyle and the decadence of which they had used to decorate this place. A marble staircase twisted to the first floor gallery. Wallace's bedroom decorated in soft pink and apricot, his in scarlet and beige. Wallace's bathroom was in scarlet and black and boasted a stone tub gilded and with a swan's neck at each end. There were 2 guest rooms, the Rose Room and the Venetian Room in red and gold, with 2 striking antique beds and a bow-fronted Venetian chest, and then 4 more guest rooms on the second floor, each with a pair of antique beds, with rugs, curtains, bed covers, cushions, towels, and even stationery in matching colors. Atop the villa was a penthouse, reached by a lift, which the Duke called the Belvedere, a mixture of office, private sitting room, and fleet admiral's quarters, where a telescope allowed him to look out to sea. It was decorated with a ship's chronometer, which had belonged to George V, ship's brass bell, and a barometer, together with golf and hunting trophies, photographs of his parents, and about half a dozen pictures of Wallace. 2 low built-in shelves of unvarnished oak held the Duke's collection of tiny toys and mementos, the result of a lifelong hobby, remembered Dinah Hood, who worked as the Duke's secretary in this period. It's interesting how when you read descriptions of things and you're being told that they're elegant, in your mind you have this like the words sound elegant, but if you were really to see what it is they're describing, you'd be like, that's tacky. And I feel like, I mean, it's just like a gold and scarlet bathroom with a gilded tub. I mean, really just think about what that really looks like. Red and gold bathroom with a big golden tub. I mean, that just is so gaudy. And I mean, everybody can have their own taste. You know, if that's really what they were into, fine, whatever. And it was a different time. But it just wouldn't be what I would choose. And I certainly would not be trying, like I've already said, to replicate something that I've left behind. But let's cast our eyes over here real quick on this description of the Duke's little hobby of miniatures that he liked to collect. His secretary described it. She said, many of the little figures were amusing. Some were rather touching, like the little set of doll's house furniture in black and gold, which included a grandfather clock, a screen, and a writing desk with a bookcase above it. There was a tiny toy tea service on a tray, a miniature table with a cocktail shaker and glasses on it, and a minute bookcase full of books. One shelf was entirely devoted to toy animals, a dog in a kennel and a dog on a chair, 2 funny little pigs, a small white frog, and a tiny green hedgehog with pink quills. That is extremely strange for a man to collect miniatures like that. I mean, I feel like if I went into a man's house, so say like I was back in my single days, and a man invited me to his house, and we go into his living room, and he has set into the wall a set of 2 shelves, and covering the shelves are dolls' furniture, little pigs, a hedgehog with pink quills, a variety of other miniatures. I feel like I would just be like, what are you all about? What's your deal? What's your vibe here? You know, because I'm not even saying that like looking at little miniature things isn't sort of interesting. Like, who doesn't enjoy the tiny bottle of Tabasco sauce? You know, I'm not saying that miniatures aren't fun, especially really tiny miniatures, especially like those Victorian era, those little books that they, like the little set of Tom Thumb. You know, it's like, okay, I'm not saying that they aren't interesting. And so maybe I should cut him some slack. But I also think the fact that he'd be traveling the globe and the one, you know, among the things he could not part with was his set of miniatures. Really? Outside the house was a crescent-shaped terrace with 6 columns facing the sea. It goes on and on and on, but the really thing that we want to hear about is the fact that above all of this flew the Prince of Wales standard. It gets weirder. The Windsors employed 16 servants, included 2 chauffeurs, a butler, and a famous French chef, and they were all dressed in a personal livery designed by the Duke, of scarlet coats with gold cuffs for formal occasions, and black suits with crimson, white, and gold-striped waistcoats during the day. There were lightweight dress suits of pale gray alpaca for summer, while in Paris they wore black suits with crimson, white and gold-striped waistcoats with silver buttons, and gold-scarlet waistcoats for formal dinners. Can you imagine living such a epic and elite life that you feel like not only that you have to have servants, but that they need to be dressed in a livery that of your design, and that you've gone out of the way to have formal uniforms made and daytime uniforms made, uniforms for them to wear in Paris versus uniforms for them to wear in the country house. It's like it's mind-blowing to me that that he would feel like this was a kind of opulence that he could afford. They had WE entwined with the king's coronet on the silver buttons of all of their suits, and this same monogram was on the uniforms, on the writing paper, on menu cards, on bed linen, on the life buoys hanging by the pool. Everything had that monogram on it. You guys, In all of that, my eyes are lingering on this. The menu cards. So you're telling me that when you show up to dinner, there would be a card on the table to tell you what you were going to eat? Can't you just wait 2 hot seconds to find out what it is? Unbelievable. Most nights, they dined out of doors at a W-shaped table on the terrace overlooking the sea, with elaborate meals such as melon with tomato ice, and eggs in crab sauce. A hairdresser came daily, and a manicurist twice a week. Royal protocol was insisted on, with guests bowing or curtsying to both Windsors on first seeing them in the morning, while the Duke's secretary had to stand while she took dictation. Weirdly, Wallis always referred to her husband as the Duke, and she was always Your Royal Highnessing about everything. And he says, and this is the most telling line of the entire chapter, everything, in short, was an attempt to recreate the life that they had lost. Harold Nicholson had been invited to dine with them, and he wrote to his wife and said, I sat next to the Duchess. He sat opposite. They called each other darling a great deal. I called him Your Royal Highness a great deal, and sir the whole time. And I called her Duchess. Isn't that quite the verbal hiccup that some people have, who are always out to prove their affection to an audience, who call each other darling, or, people don't do that so much now, but it's always like, hey, baby, or it's just like always these terms of endearment that are, it's fine, all well and good, but it's like, those couples that insist on it, almost because they have to prove to you how much they love each other. He went on to say that one cannot get away from his glamour and his charm and his sadness, though I must say he seemed gay enough. They have a villa here and a yacht, and they go round and round. He digs in the garden, but it is pathetic the way he's sensitive about her. It was quite clear to me, from what she said, that she hopes to get back to England. When I asked her why she didn't get a house of her own somewhere, she said, one never knows what may happen. I don't want to spend all my life in exile. So the reason that she won't buy a place is because she still thinks she's going to get to England? Sweet lady, you're going to need to lay down that dream. It ain't happening. There were reoccurring attempts by the palace during this period to try and give the Windsors some position. It was palpable that there was a lot of bitterness from the Duke and the Duchess towards the palace. And again, I just cannot even fathom, because you guys chose to leave. This was your choice. It was like, you can stay, but you can't be together officially. But nobody ever told him that he couldn't have her as his mistress. And she was fine with that arrangement. And nobody had ever put the kibosh on any of his wilding out. You want to be sleeping around with a bunch of married women? Everyone was like, A-okay, which really and truly is astounding that just side note, it just occurred to me. As the head of the church, they all wanted to say, you can't marry a divorced woman. But when he wanted to make it official and not be sleeping around with the divorced woman and not be hanging around with a mistress and not be living in a life of sin, when he wanted to do the quote unquote right thing, then they said he couldn't do that, but they they all knew that he was having mistresses and having affairs. No one was ever sitting him down and be like, look, as head of the church, you could not be seeing all these women/men. Nobody ever bothered with that. But when he wanted to make it right, then they were like, no, she's divorced. I can totally see why he was angry about that and why he acted out and said, well, then I'm leaving completely. Because that is completely morally inconsistent. Either you want the man married and you want him to be solely devoted to his wife, or you let the man do whatever he wants and you don't say anything. But you can't be like, well, we'll turn a blind eye to this sexual sin, but over here, there's some divorce, so no, you can't. Like, that doesn't even make sense. You need to have a line with this person. So I do think that it's very frustrating. I think his situation was very frustrating. I think that he was in his rights to be angry and annoyed that was the stance that was taken. Particularly because, like I said, other lifestyle choices were totally fine. And everyone knew that stuff was going on. And it was not a big secret. So I understand why he's bitter. But at the same time, those were the rules that he had been born to play within. So he's just going to have to accept it. And he was just going to have to accept that he chose to leave. So he can't be bitter about it now. But there was bitterness. And so the palace was trying to find a way that maybe they could sort of stitch together some kind of vague camaraderie and, like, let's not live apart. And the palace suggested that it might be a good move to do something to remove some of this bitter feeling. And they thought that maybe the Duke and Duchess could be asked to dine on some suitable occasion at the embassy. But it never really worked out for them to be seen together as a family. In this idea that they might dine together at a suitable occasion at the embassy, which is rather, cold idea in my mind as a solution to bringing some kind of familial peace. Like, well, the olive branch that we'll offer is that you'll be allowed to go eat at the embassy at a time of our choosing. Who cares about that? That's not okay. It's not exactly a big win. But their discord was further exposed when the Windsors went and chartered a 200-ton motor yacht for 6 weeks and cruised up and down the coast of Italy when the king and his wife came to France on a diplomatic visit. And that because there was some concern that the Windsors would upstage the king, they were basically asked if they would just go. And they did. I mean, it's not exactly a burden to go and hang out on a yacht for 6 weeks with your good friends, Herman and Catherine Rogers, but it was yet one more feather in their embittered cap and then we were shoved out of our home because the king decided to set foot, in the country that we are now living in. Queen Mary was very perturbed at all of this discontent in her family, and she wrote to the Duke and said, "You'll remember how miserable I was when you informed me of your intended marriage and abdication, and how I implored you not to do so for our sake and the sake of the country. You did not seem able to take any point of view but your own. My feelings for you as your mother remain the same, and our being parted and the cause of it grieve me beyond words. After all my life I've put my country before everything else, and I simply cannot change now." And that would just be so difficult if you had always lived your life where country came first and you thought you'd raise your children to also care about that, and then for them to just show complete detachment from their duties and from their country, and to feel like you had maybe and somehow failed the country and failed your children in teaching them their duty. It would have been a heavy weight to bear. Relations within the family remained strained, not helped by the mutual antipathy between the new queen and Wallis. Wallis called her Cookie, and Elizabeth, who had never rectified herself to Wallis, always referred to Wallis as that woman. At the end of August, Monckton, remember that's their lawyer, was summoned to Balmoral, joining Neville Chamberlain, who had succeeded Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister, to discuss a possible visit of the Duke to Britain in November of 1938. Chamberlain wanted him to, quote, be treated as soon as possible as a younger brother of the king, who could take some of the royal functions off his brother's hands. The king was not fundamentally against the prime minister's view, but the queen was against him having any effective sphere of work on the grounds that he was a threat to her husband, who was less superficially endowed with the arts and graces that please. Okay, so there were people at the palace and in government who thought, okay, enough is enough. The exile thing is, when are we going to get past that? This is not the look we want. Also, the king's got way too much to do, and he's got a brother capable of helping out. So let's just bring him back in. Let's all just forget the fact that this brother, David, was supposed to be king, and let's just sort of flip roles. He'll act as the younger brother. He'll act as the spare, and we'll give him some stuff to do, because this king has way too much going on. But the queen said, no. If he sets foot on this soil, he's going to try to inch his way into more and more authority, and he's a threat to my husband because my husband doesn't have the ability to speak and to carry himself in the same way that David does. David is just a much more flamboyant personality, and people seem to take to him, and he's just a better speaker. And if he comes, he's going to inch his way into and scoot my husband out of the place that is now rightfully his. I see her point, and I think it was a good point. I think that the king was a great king, and I think that he did a wonderful job, and I think that it was his greatness that led to Elizabeth's greatness. She was fathered by a very good person. But the reality is that he doesn't seem like he was the sort of person that would sabotage somebody else. He doesn't seem scathing and manipulative, and he certainly wasn't backed by a scathing and manipulative wife. So I think that the reality of David coming in and trying to sort of usurp some of the authority away from his brother is a completely logical fear. The discussions rumbled on through the autumn, with no change of attitude for the royal family, and growing concerns that the Duke might become a rallying point for Mosley's fascists and other organizations. People felt that he just could not be trusted, that he had already shown himself to have too much allegiance with the far right. And it just seemed like, let's just not invite somebody whose political associations are so questionable. He shouldn't even be having these political associations as king. If we let him in, it might mark us as approving of this ideology. I've been warned in the most emphatic terms that such a visit would evoke strong protest and controversy, wrote Chamberlain to the Duke, reporting on public opinion toward a Windsor's visit in the spring of 1938. He'd received almost 200 letters, and of those, over 90% in one way or another expressed opinions adverse to the proposal. This was supposed to be a special branch report. It's openly stated in circles connected with the press that the Duke of Windsor has been in touch with certain newspaper proprietors with the object of starting a publicity campaign in this country in order to create an atmosphere favorable to the return of himself and the Duchess of Windsor. It was clear that the Windsors were to be kept out of Britain. So, just like Harry and Meghan do, Harry obviously is all the day long scorning the press, but he uses it all the time for his own ambitions. And we've seen he and Meghan do that all the time. And the same situation was here. The Duke and Duchess were contacting newspapers, trying to drum up publicity for them, trying to get positive stories in the press so that they could come back to England. And that Wallis was all the day yang in David's ear about, I want to go back to England. I want to go back to England. The very fact that she would not allow them to purchase a home overseas because she kept expecting that one day they would go back indicates to us that there was a lot of behind closed doors conversations where you better get things worked out. I want to go back. Get things worked out. I'm done with this extended vacation. So David's over there trying to do his level best to find a way back in, asking the palace to let him come back, trying to navigate some kind of deal where he can possibly do work again for the royal family. It has to be said that a life of leisure is only satisfying for so long. And then it's boring, because the enjoyment of leisure is the work that leads up to it. And so to all the day long just be doing what you want to do, there's no worth to a life like that. There's no sense of accomplishment to a life like that. If you don't have a goal you're trying to attain, life is so boring. There's just nothing to do. And it just becomes very, very mundane and sad and depressing. So I can imagine that they are looking for something to do. And England is really the only place that could offer them those possibilities.